if someone dared to say, I represent the person sitting next to me, that person would be considered to be a slave. That concept of representation was non-existent in Athenian democracy. These are concepts who are lost to us today, having politicians holding them responsible for even for the bills that they propose. It was not easy for someone to get on the stage and start discussing and proposing bills, because they would be responsible for their actions. And if those bills were proven to be destructive to the state, they would pay a heavy price. So it was direct participation, but with a big sense of responsibility. And these were the people who could make decisions on issues of life and death, actually. And this is truly because they were able to decide upon waging wars, on brokering for peace with their enemies. This is a democratic process. We don't have that in Greece. We don't have that in many Western countries. We see this in the US, but it's not perfect. The people should be able to vote not only for the winners of an election, but also for the candidates.
Today's conversation is intentionally different. I want to step away just for a moment from the usual geopolitical headlines and talk about something more fundamental: democracy itself. It's a word we hear constantly in the West. It's invoked, it's defended, it's exported, even fought over. But how often do we stop and ask what democracy actually means? Today, we're going to go back to its origins, to ancient Greece, to explore three critical questions. What democracy truly looked like in ancient Athens, how that system differs from what we call democracy today, and whether modern political systems are facing a deeper crisis of representation, legitimacy, and participation. To help unpack this, I'm joined by Stavros Kalenteridis. He's a professor of international relations, political communication specialist, and a scholar of history and political philosophy with academic training in Greece, the US, and Cyprus. His most recent book, Gods of Democracy, When Citizens Ruled, an overview of Athenian democracy, explores these ideas in depth. And the link to the book will be provided in the description box below. This is a conversation about citizens versus voters, participation versus representation, and whether modern democracy still serves the people it claims to represent. So let's begin. Stavro, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
When modern Western society, Stavro, talk about democracy today, people often assume it's the same system that began in ancient Athens. So setting modern states aside for a moment, how did Athenian democracy actually function in principle in terms of participation, decision-making, and where political power truly rested?
This is interesting because we get these two concepts mixed up, the so-called modern democracy and the Athenian one. Actually, it wasn't just the Athenians who enjoyed the blessed fruit of democracy. Other ancient Greek city-states had this form of government, actually. This is something that we don't discuss a lot, but indeed, other city-states did enjoy this form of I would say, revolutionary form of government. So in the case of the Athenians, and we have more information about the Athenian democracy, which was the first one, mind you, the citizens truly ruled. So the citizens were both being ruled and ruling at the same time themselves. So we had this concept of direct citizen participation. This was a small city-state, so we had about 6,000 people who had the right to vote, the right of citizenship. And these were the people who could make decisions on issues of life and death, actually. And this is truly because they were able to decide upon waging wars, on brokering for peace with their enemies. So they had the ultimate authority, and the people participated by themselves. There was no representation allowed. If someone dared to say, I represent the person sitting next to me, that person would be considered to be a slave. That concept of representation was non-existent in Athenian democracy. So the people directly participated. They were the ones who made the suggestions, and the legislative bills, they originated from ordinary citizens. So this process began with people. It was not easy for someone to get on the stage and start discussing and proposing bills, because they would be responsible for their actions. These are concepts who are lost to us today, having politicians holding them responsible for even for the bills that they propose. So citizens in ancient Athenian democracy, when they suggested for some action, some course of action, or for a bill, they were responsible for those bills. And if those bills were proven to be destructive to the state, they would pay a heavy price. So it was direct participation, but with a big sense of responsibility.
When you say they would pay a heavy price, can you give some examples of?
Sure. So it depends, depending on the crime committed, because it was one thing to misguide your fellow citizens. It was another to betray them by, for instance, being bought out by the enemies of the Athenian state. One person, a demagogue or a sycophant, could actually suggest a course of action which would be destructive on purpose. This was the most heinous of crimes, because that person was considered to be a slave of the enemy, and they were trying to enslave the whole of society, which again was the most heinous of crimes. So depending on the crime, people would have to pay a fine. People would lose their political rights, which was considered to be a significant humiliation for an Athenian. The idea of participating, now you lost your political rights, was one of the biggest humiliations. And then even losing your property, your house, maybe even exile, and maybe even death.
Interesting. But Stavros, democracy did not emerge randomly. It was born in a very specific place and historical moment. Why? Why did democracy arise specifically in ancient Athens? What political, social, economic forces led to the creation of this entirely new system of governance? And what problem was it designed to solve?
Interesting question. So I think this is something that the book actually deals with the most. This concept of this big question: why at this point in time and in this city, the city of Athens, what were the ingredients of this volatile mix, this revolutionary cocktail that led to this form of government? I would say it was truly a mix of things. That part of them had to do with the ancient Greek world, part of them had to do with Athens by itself. So, for instance, the concept of philosophy, which was something that originated from Asia Minor, from the Greek city-states of Asia Minor, not from Athens, was, I would say, one of the very first ingredients that we have here. This concept of philosophy as a force for improving one's life. The questions that were raised by the political philosophers at the time, such as who rules this country, this city-state? Is it the few people who rule this country, or is it the many, or is it one? Is one person better equipped to rule, or do we need a government of the many? Do one man or many men rule wisely? Do they rule better or not? So these kind of questions led the discussion for political empowerment and improvement. So philosophy was definitely part of that mix. Then we had the concept of the Hellenic athleticism, this spirit of competing, because as I tried to describe a little bit at the beginning, the citizens competed at the public arena when they participated in politics. So that part of working together in competition, we saw that from sports actually. Then we had the theater, which was something that was found in ancient Athens that was unique, and the concept of theater as a political event. And it developed by a poet, but it was shown on stage, and it raised political and ethical and social dilemmas at the time. and all theater was political. The topics were political, and the audience, the citizens who participated in this communal experience in the theaters, they were asked to pick a side in this dilemma. So, for instance, Antigone in Sophocles' play, she is forbidden to bury her brother by the state, by the ruler of the country. At the same time, there's the divine law of burying one's loved ones, one's family members. And this dilemma, who is right, the law of the city, of the state, or the law of the gods and of family? This dilemma is something that the poets at the time, they raised in front of their fellow citizens, and this process cultivated this political DNA of deliberating and debating before making any decision. So there's both sides of this dilemma were explained on the play. The actors were basically deliberating, debating, and then there was the decision at the end. So this process of debate and speaking freely, this was embedded through the theater. And finally, I would say from the most important elements, because this is a rather complex issue, but I would say one of the most important elements for having democracy being born in ancient Athens was the idea of having a strong navy. Back at the time, the people fighting the wars with Persia, with Egypt, all of these ancient wars, it was only the rich who were able to equip themselves with the armor and the shield, sometimes with horses, war horses. The people had to fend for themselves, had to buy these equipment themselves. And as you can imagine, it was only the aristocracy, the rich, who were able to wage these wars. So when Athens decided to invest on their navy, in creating this powerful navy that we know of even today, and this navy, they needed people to row the triremes, this famous ancient Athenian ships, and they had to mobilize the masses. The less affluent at the time had to serve in the navy, and these people who were not the rich, sometimes they were the poor people who had to serve in the navy. These people started asking for political rights as well, because they were the ones who fought the Athenian wars. They fought and bled and died for Athens, so they should be able to make decisions about Athens. And thus, this was, I guess, the tipping point. After the founding of the big Athenian navy, we see this form of government being developed.
And they were given rights, these sort of people, the lower class people who were sent to fight.
Exactly. Gradually, we see political rights being expanded to the lower classes.
Interesting. So let's talk about the founding fathers of democracy. Figures like Solon, Clisthenes, and Pericles are often described as the founding fathers of democracy. What did each of them actually contribute to the democratic system?
So there are many people who were involved in this process. Again, this is a gradual process. This is a process that took almost more than 100 years to fully materialize to what we know as the peak of Athenian democracy of the 5th century BCE, the time of Pericles specifically. So Solon was truly the first one. He had the power of a governor or a prime minister, to conventionally speak, or president, conventionally speaking. This individual, he recreated the founding laws. He gave some power to the people by establishing the so-called citizens' courts. This was really important because the people had the ability now to appeal to the citizens' courts directly themselves. So it wasn't the elites who were running the courts. This was a big move by Solon. And another person down the line of these big evolutions of the form of government was Ephialtes, not the famous Ephialtes of Sparta, who betrayed the Spartan king Leonidas, but the Athenian, another person, a politician. He actually used these courts that Solon founded to move against the corrupt oligarchs at the time. So Ephialtes used Solon's courts to put the oligarchs in front of the people, and he basically took their power from them and gave them back to the people. Clisthenes was also a big important figure because he created a classless system. There were no classes under Clisthenes. He found a really innovative way to unite the poorest class with the rich classes in one voting unit, if you will. He created voting blocks that included people from richer areas and districts and from poorer neighborhoods as well. And he forced them to work together in a sense. That was also pretty smart and innovative. Then we had Themistocles, who was the one actually investing in the navy. Again, that was what led to the ultimate emergence of the democratic form of government. And then finally, we had Pericles. I would say that it's interesting to note here that Pericles was counseling the people. He was not the president the same way Solon was. So we can see the development over time. In 100 years' time, we see that Solon was governor, and then Pericles was making suggestions to the people. The people were deciding in Pericles' time. So that's the difference right there.
So interesting. And I want to touch upon the myths of Athenian democracy. I mean, it's called a democracy. People even until now, especially in the Western world, think that everyone had a say. But the truth is, I mean, it's idealized Athenian democracy. Yet the truth is that women, slaves, which you mentioned earlier, and non-citizens had no political rights. So how should we understand these exclusions today? Are they evidence that Athenian democracy was fundamentally flawed? Or are we imposing modern moral standards on an ancient political system?
I would say it's something completely different. There's a third answer here. There are some very unique myths against ancient, I would say, Greek democracy now, because we had this experiment in other city-states, and we have our answers from them as well. So there are many myths around this form of government. As I mentioned, this was a process. This was not a fixed moment in time that we had democracy in Athens and then we didn't. This was a gradual process that we had to have many people, revolutionaries, luminaries at the time, to fix this form of government. And as I said, when we began with Solon was an executive leader. He had immense power in his hands. He made many new laws and changes. But then Pericles, he was just consulting the people in politics. So that was the process. Similarly, the people who were eligible to vote and get elected, vote and get elected in Solon's time were the few, the power and the rich. But gradually over time, we see that during the time of Pericles, basically all the people, the classless people, the poor, the destitute, were able not only to vote and get elected, but also they were being paid to participate in political activities, because they didn't have the capacity to lose a day's wage. So they had to have some support, some subsidy from the state. So this was a process. It didn't begin as everybody would think, that everybody participated and everybody voted. No, there was a process. So in actuality, there were the slaves. Actually, the slaves were not slaves. The slaves were bond servants. This is also interesting. There was no form of slavery in the ancient Greek world. There was no concept of imprisoning someone. There were no jails, for instance, no prisons. So the bond servants were people who lost in battle, and the ancient Greeks had three options. Option number one was to kill them, execute them. Option number two was to let them loose. They would go back to their countries and they would fight again, or to keep them as bond servants, meaning that they would be able to buy their own freedom again in due time. And these people had rights in ancient Athens. They had rights that they could even sue a governor, actually, at the time. They could, at the citizens' courts, a bond servant, which is not a slave. Slaves, we had them in Rome or in other parts of the world. That was not the case in the ancient Greek world. The bond servants were able to sue even a governor at the time, an archon, as they were called. So they had rights. There were also the foreigners, other Greeks who were not from Athens, Also, they didn't have the ability to vote or get elected. Women as well, even though in this instance you are right, because we are judging the ancient Greek world or the ancient world in general. But we forget that less than 100 years ago, women were not eligible to vote in the Western world, the so-called Western world as well. So that
I
was a
think
problem right there.
In Greece, they first started voting in the 50s, actually, right?
Yeah, yes. Yeah, so this is interesting. Even now, women are fighting for their rights. So, yeah, that's not fair to say the least. But women at the time had more rights than women in other parts of the world, like in Persia, for instance, or in Asia, in other parts of Asia. So, women in the Greek world had the ability to become queens. They were eligible to participate in the Olympic Games, specifically in sports related with horse riding games. So they did have rights. But the very concept here is that there were foreigners, there were poor people, there were women and bond servants. They didn't have the right to vote, but this was a evolutionary process. We didn't see how democracy would evolve further, because we had the civil war between Sparta and Athens, and then we had the Roman legions taking over the Greek world, and then there was no democracy. But we can see how things could have developed differently, and that more people would be involved in the political process. There were some plays at the time by Aristophanes, for instance. Quite a few of them, actually. I do remember two of them, Ecclesiazouses and Thesmophoriazouses, where the women were able to vote. So the Athenians were discussing about this. Even in a satire political play, the Athenians were discussing about what would happen if women not only voted, but if women governed. So that was part of the public debate at the time.
Yeah, it was part of the public. For Aristophanes to make plays out of it means it was part of the public discussion. And who knows, as you say, where things would have led had it not been for history evolving in the direction it did evolve with the Persia-Athens civil war and the Romans. So, yeah, could have been completely different, and they would have had a right to vote.